Hey everyone, this is Blake. Today I'm going to be giving you an introduction to disadvantages, also called disads or DAs. So first up, what is a disad? It is a negative argument. It is most often read as an off-case position. It is very similar to a contention in the way that it structures argumentation. It basically says here's a specific area of focus, such as the economy, and here's how doing the AF is going to affect that area of interest. So whereas the AF in an affirmative contention would typically say, here's why the AF is good, it affects this area of focus positively, the disad, because it's a negative position, is saying why the AF is a bad idea or why it affects a certain area of focus negatively. Most often, this is not read along with a framework. It's totally fine to pair a couple of disads up with a framework and read them together, but that's just called an in-C. It's not an off-case position. It's just a way of structuring that first negative speech. And like I said, that's totally fine, but more often than not, you're going to see a disad just read as an off-case position by itself, and the impacts will just be articulated under whatever framework is read elsewhere in the round, most often the AFS framework. So even though it's not typically read with a framework, the disad impact should always be contextualized to some framework somewhere in the round. So the parts of a disad, we're going to talk about them all together right now, and then we'll get into each of them more specifically. Uniqueness is basically a description of what the world looks like right now and why everything is okay, why bad stuff isn't happening. It is very much descriptive of whatever the current situation is. The next part is the link. It basically says what the AF does to change that situation described by the uniqueness. What is the effect that the affirmative getting voted for or getting passed has. And most often this is an unforeseen effect because we're trying to point out a flaw in the way that the affirmative has framed this issue. So we're going to be saying the AF said it does all this good stuff, but it ignored the fact, or it did not foresee the fact that it has this negative effect elsewhere. And then the last part of a disad is the impact. Why does this all matter? What is the negative result of the AF and the change that the AF does as described in the link? So on to uniqueness specifically. Like I said, uniqueness is a description. It's descriptive in nature as opposed to prescriptive. It's a description of the status quo, which you'll also just hear abbreviated to SQUO a lot of times in debate. They mean the same thing. It's basically just the way things are right now, the current balance of things. So the role of a uniqueness in the disad is that it proves that not doing the AF avoids the impact. In other words, the disad is not saying we should do something instead of doing the affirmative. It's not providing its own action, but it's rather saying that we should do nothing. So the uniqueness is saying the way that things currently exist is good, so doing nothing is good. So in order to prove that it is okay to do nothing, you need to prove that the current situation is good or not causing the impact described in the disad. That's what the uniqueness does. It also helps prove that the disad is a unique way to cause the harms described in the impact. So that's where the term uniqueness comes from. So this last bullet here says that it may make risk claims. What that's referring to is it might say that we are at high risk for something to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means and what that is called a bit later. So the next part is the link. It basically is saying that the AF does something that is a direct result of the affirmative plan or the topic being implemented. This is the topical part of the disad. By that, I mean that it is the part that actually directly addresses the affirmative, that's specific to the affirmative or whatever topic is being discussed, because the uniqueness is just a description of the world, and the impact is just a hypothetical description of a bad thing that could happen. The link is the part that says that the topic is somehow involved in this discussion. So basically, the uniqueness describes a world that is okay, the impact describes a world that is worse, and the link is what connects or links the two worlds that are described. So the link is how we go from the situation described in the uniqueness to the situation described in the impact. So the impact is the result of the change described in the link. So the link is saying the AF does something that will ultimately change the status quo, and that change in the status quo results in something bad. It's often an extreme scenario like extinction or something along those lines, or extreme global warming, because it is more persuasive and more impactful to say that something extreme is going to happen. If one person gets up and says doing the AF is like it's going to cause 30 people to lose their jobs, and then another person gets up and says doing the AF is going to cause total economic collapse, the total economic collapse one sounds a lot more persuasive. So oftentimes you're going to be dealing with an extreme scenario that may not be quite as realistic, but it's important to understand the role that having an extreme impact plays in persuasion. So it's always a good thing to make sure that your impacts are large and not too focused on myopic scenarios. So there are, generally speaking, two types of disads. There are brink disads and linear disads. So the brink disad is saying that we are going to cross some type of line, some type of brink that's going to cause a new bad thing to occur. So the way that the example that a lot of people give to kind of explain what brink disad means is to think about a cliff, and at the bottom of the cliff there's a bunch of spikes or maybe a trap, a pit, fire, whatever, something bad, and there's somebody standing on the edge of the cliff. So this person is fine right now. They could stand there for hours and hours, and nothing really bad would happen. So as far as the status quo goes, this person is totally fine. But if a force comes in, like if somebody pushes him, or if there's a strong gust of wind that knocks him off the cliff, he's going to fall down here, and all of a sudden something bad's going to happen. So we're going from a situation where we're totally fine to a situation where we are very bad. A more practical example of this that you'd see in debate is something like nuclear war. We are not currently engaged in a nuclear war, but certain actions could cause it to happen. In other words, we are totally fine right now in terms of nuclear war, but we could all of a sudden see it happen in an instant. Linear disads, however, are dealing with magnitude. It's when something bad already exists and it gets worsened. So as opposed to saying that we went from a good or normal situation to a bad situation like we do with this brink description, we are moving linearly from a bad situation to a worse one. So basically, when we're talking about the distinction between linear and brink disads, the difference is the impact already occurring, or does the impact, or would the instance of the aft be the first or the breaking point for this impact suddenly coming into creation? So if we're thinking about these types of disads and the way that it might affect the way that we write or attack these disads, one of the things that we should consider is that with linear type disads, uniqueness is going to be significantly less important. So this makes sense because when we think about the role that uniqueness plays in a disad, it is saying that everything is fine in the status quo or that an impact isn't happening. But with linear disads, that's not true. An impact is happening and it's just getting worse. So brink disads are most likely dealing with things that we call big stick impacts, such as extinction or economic collapse, whereas linear disads are typically dealing with structural issues that are more related to things like discrimination, like racism and sexism. So for example, you're not going to find a uniqueness evidence for a linear disad that says racism doesn't exist, but you can likely find a piece of evidence for the link that says that doing something is going to lead to more racial discrimination. So with brink disads, uniqueness is just as important as anything else, whereas with linear disads, the uniqueness kind of takes a backseat. So just a couple of strategic considerations when we're talking about the parts of a disad and writing disads. It's really important that we reinforce our links. Like I said, the link is the topical part of the disad. So if we lose our link in the debate, we are just talking about these two hypothetical worlds described by the uniqueness and the impact, but there's no reason why that has any applicability to the debate at hand or the topic that is being discussed. So you can reinforce your links a couple of ways. You can just have multiple links. This can either be multiple pieces of evidence or multiple warrants within one piece of evidence, multiple ways to back up the same claim, anything of that nature. Or you can reinforce links by having really strong credibility backing up the claims in the link. So the ways that we can get credibility are things like highly qualified authors, if we're dealing with a professor or a organization or an expert in the field or something of that nature, or if we are dealing with something that is empirically derived, proven by history, based on studies, something like that. So more credible links are much harder to refute, so having credible links or multiple credible links are going to put you in a much better situation than just having one flimsy link that can easily be taken out. Another thing that's really important is to embed impact weighing. We have a video that is all about weighing, so if you're not quite sure what that means or how to do that, I'd strongly recommend you watch that video. It's too much for me to get into just here, but what I mean by embedding impact weighing is after you read your impact evidence, have independent justifications for why that impact is bad or worse than the impacts that are described by the AF. So that way you kind of give yourself something to work with in your rebuttal speeches to give you a head start on the weighing that you're going to have to do later on in the round. So make sure that you put some impact weighing stuff in the DISAD itself. And lastly, be prepared for evidence comparison. A lot of times with DISADs, we can get really into the weeds with these types of debates about whose author said what and whose author is more credible, which study has better methods, things of that nature. Because obviously the AF and the neg have very different interpretations of what the affirmative advocacy is going to be doing. So they're going to be pushing your evidence in comparison to their evidence. So be prepared to have the debate about why your methodology, why your author is better. So do extra research into that type of evidence. And that's it for the intro to DISAD. So hope it helped, and thanks for watching.